Hi everyone, good afternoon. This is the session on the Global Biodiversity Framework and monitoring the human-wildlife conflict component of it. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Luna Milatovic, who's our new policy officer in the specialist group, to talk us through.
Thanks, Alex. So good afternoon and welcome everyone. I think in the last 2 days, well, today and yesterday, we already heard how human-wildlife conflict is now in the Global Biodiversity Framework, so we don't need to go over that. But I think what the aim of today is to go through what are the options to measure this? How can we monitor the progress towards this target? Because at the moment we don't really have nationwide systems to monitor and measure human-wildlife conflict. So the idea is to just to quickly guide you through how the session will go is that we are going to have a quick overview by Alex about the indicator and what's been done so far, the wording of the indicator as it is now in the monitoring framework, and then we're going to have 3 very short presentations of each of the components of the indicator that we are suggesting. These are just very initial thoughts, so we are here to brainstorm and talk. So after this, we will have a panel discussion between 5 countries. So each government is from a different region, which I think will provide a really good perspective on how things are done or how things should be done. And then at the end, because we really want to make this session as interactive as possible, we want to have at least 15 minutes for discussion. And there's also going to be a Google form for everyone who doesn't get a chance to speak to submit their views. So yeah, without further ado, I will let Alex start with the short overview.
Thanks, Luna. Okay, so how, I think we don't need to go over the background of how we got to this point, but just to briefly say that the fact that human-wildlife conflict is explicitly in a target in the GBF is really, really important. And there were many, many organizations, many individuals who really pushed for that over the last few years. And what is also really nice, the way it has ended up, is that the wording, I think, is pretty good. And those of you who followed, there it is. That's the wording of Target 4. So those of you who followed this process, to what extent, are many people here have been following the whole the post-2020 framework? So you're quite familiar with some of this. So you will also be familiar with the painful back and forth negotiations that take place to get to this end document. And just, I was always completely zooming in on this one. The topic itself moved around the framework. So it was at one point in Target 9 about people. Very briefly, it was for a while in Target 5 about sustainable use, and it then settled down here. And there was a debate still. This is very much the species target. And so, human-wildlife conflict isn't just a species issue, and some would say it's more a people issue. But we decided, and many people thought, the most important thing is that it's there. And then let's work with it. And so personally, I think it's a really good and very, very important milestone for this field. Okay, so we got there, yay. What's next? And so what has to happen now for a large number of these targets is that there has to be a monitoring framework which is in preparation at different stages of development. So some of the many of the targets have existing established indicators for how you monitor progress towards that particular target. And there obviously isn't one for human-wildlife conflict. And that's something that needs to happen. And we're going to try and explore. So who here has ever tried to think about how to measure and monitor human-wildlife conflict? And have you given up? Or has anyone got the magic answer? Because then we could just, no. So all of you who work in this topic will, I think, intuitively sense that this is going to be difficult. Not only, imagine just trying to accurately monitor and measure human-wildlife conflict in one place, but now do that in 196 countries. And of course, not every single country will want to or have to monitor this particular conservation issue, but a lot of them will, because for a lot of countries it is such a hot topic. And so you're talking about things like human-elephant conflict in 50 states, but then you're also talking about bird conflicts in a small nation like Malta, or puma conflicts in Paraguay, or the whole range. So how does one go about that? And so in the specialist group, we certainly think that other than try, there's not, we have to try and at least bring ideas together. So what we're going to be trying to do over the next few years is just facilitate the effort. Not come with the answer, because we don't have the answer either, definitely, but also it's really, really important that this is a joint think operation, a joint process of lots of different parties and experts of different angles coming together to try and figure out how to do this, and then see if it's possible. And so some sort of draft idea needs to be ready-ish for the next COP, which I believe is towards the end of 2024. Okay, so we just want to stimulate thinking on this and just get your thoughts also. And to just kick off some thoughts, I would like to start with, this is a starting point, throw something at you rather than a blank page. This is where we've got to so far. And we did have an online workshop in this back in July last year, which 8 countries came to, and various conservation specialists. And so here's a starting proposal to work with, is that if it's a framework style indicator, there might be 3 components. And the first component might be the most obvious thing, which is impacts. So that's the thing we tend to gravitate towards measuring, because you can sort of count lost cattle and land, and these are quantifiable metrics. However, as we're discussing throughout the conference, and as is evident, human-wildlife conflict has a ton of qualitative aspects to it. And how on earth do you measure that? And so we suggest that there is a second component, which is all about the social, the tolerance, the social capacity to live with wildlife. And so that you see already instantly, that brings in strongly all social science expertise and metrics and ways of measuring quantitatively and qualitatively how much humans and societies are able to coexist with wildlife. And then we suggest that actually there's a huge element underneath all that that is about process, about collaborative thinking, multi-stakeholder decision-making, and so on. And that underpins it all. And that itself is worth also tracking and monitoring, because if you can show that you haven't got to coexistence, but you show that you're on the right track because of a good process, then that is worth also capturing in an indicator. So that's a starting proposal for us to explore. So I'm going to invite my colleagues to just elaborate on each of these in a little bit more in turn. And we're going to start with the impacts, right? So Simon Hedges is going to tell us his ideas on that.
So I'm going to be talking about some of the opportunities and challenges for measuring impacts of human-wildlife conflict, particularly focusing on the first of those 3 components that Alex just introduced us to, and then finish off briefly talking about the second component before handing over to Diogo. So we all know, I think, that the impacts of human-wildlife conflict are multifaceted. There's the direct damage done by wildlife to crops, to livestock, and so on. Then there's also the indirect, intangible costs and impacts of human-wildlife conflict, particularly such things as the opportunity costs when you forego the opportunity to work because you're guarding your crops, or your kids are too tired to go to school, and these kind of things. And then transaction costs, particularly delays in getting compensation and those kind of things, and the pressures that those kind of things bring about. And then the health and stress type of costs. So it's a multi-dimensional problem that needs to be assessed. But if we talk about initially just the direct damage done by wildlife to crops or to livestock or so on, it's a tremendous challenge to monitor these kinds of damage, even at the single site scale. You've got a number of complications to do with the type of crop, whether the damage done by the wildlife has actually completely destroyed the crop, whether you can still harvest some of it, what time of year it was damaged, whether it will still grow back, and this kind of stuff. It's very, very time consuming to do, and it requires quite a lot of goodwill of the farmers or livestock owners to go into their fields and stuff and assess this over and over again. And to do it at the kind of scale required by the GBF for all the types of wildlife which cause damage to property and to crops and so on, across all the countries where that occurs, is a phenomenal undertaking. Not many countries are really doing it in a systematic way. There's a lot of unreliability in the data, and it's not, I'd argue, not really realistic to suggest that there's going to be some initiative to go out and collect it in a representative way for the GBF. It's also, I mentioned the problems with crops. Damage to or killing of livestock is also tricky. This is a deer which was killed by an Asian wild dog, a dhole, ranched deer. These are classic kill signs of a dhole, but not always. We're not always so lucky that the predators, the carnivores, leave such clear calling signs, so we can't always identify which animal was responsible, what type of animal was responsible for livestock death. So again, adding a complication. Possibly somewhat simpler than measuring crop damage, but still tremendously challenging to do at scale. As I mentioned earlier, it leaves out a lot of these opportunity and other indirect costs, which are in many cases the bigger cause of the impact on people. The opportunities lost to do other work, for example, often are actually the larger socio-economic impacts of HWC compared to direct loss of crops. Not always, of course, and it varies from place to place. But to get the full picture, the full impact, the socio-economic impact of human-wildlife conflict, we do need to understand these things, arguably. But they're difficult to assess, even more difficult than measuring the damage in the fields. And again, potentially possible at certain site levels for particular projects, but hard to imagine being done at significant spatial scales across the globe for the GBF. So there's some interest in using measures of multidimensional well-being as an alternative or to augment measures of direct damage. And this is one example of quite an influential paper by Woodhouse et al. Came out a few years ago. But again, if you look at the various components of these multidimensional approach, subjective evaluation experiences, objective and relational aspects, again, these are tremendously time-consuming and sometimes quite challenging things to evaluate interacting with stakeholders who have suffered from conflict. So it's time-consuming and, again, hard to imagine really working at scale. So another option, either to address the second component that Alex introduced to us a few minutes ago, or potentially and arguably something that might integrate those other impacts, the direct and the indirect intangible impacts, is to actually just measure tolerance to wildlife as a kind of umbrella metric which encapsulates these other direct and indirect impacts, because people's attitudes to wildlife are going to be affected, and their tolerance of wildlife are going to be affected by their experiences and their losses and so on. This is a picture from a paper by Dr. Kansky and her colleagues. Some of you may have seen Dr. Kansky speaking yesterday about this particular model for assessing tolerance. There are others, of course, and potentially simpler ones which might lend themselves to the purposes of the GBF, because they're more straightforward perhaps and require fewer data sources to populate properly. But I do think this is a promising approach, both for, as I say, in integrating the impacts for component one, but also as a way of measuring the impacts under component two. So just to summarise then, there is a pressing need in many site-based studies of human-wildlife conflict to get a full understanding of the socio-economic impact of conflict. But whether that's possible to do at the scale required for the GBF is a very significant question, and I suggest the answer is probably no. There is this increasing interest in using measures of well-being, but they themselves are also still time-consuming to collect, and unlikely, I think, to be operational at the global scale. For the GBF, the metrics do need to be simple and pragmatic, quick to collect, easy to collect, and applicable for all the different species and all the different contexts that HWC occurs in across the globe. And I do think that tolerance might well be a significant step forward to addressing that challenge. So I'll now hand it over to Diogo, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of those things.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Diogo. I'm a researcher here at the University of Oxford. I'm going to talk to you about one potential approach that could be used to focus on this second component that we're calling willingness to coexist with wildlife. I think Simon's already reiterated a lot of the challenges that we're facing when it comes to collecting any data set in a standardized fashion globally. And this is sort of an attempt to, a different attempt, I would probably argue, to go about it. So, we live in an increasingly connected world. We have currently 66% of the world's population that is online. We have 95% of the world's population covered by mobile broadband, and that means that people have increasingly access to information that is virtual. At the same time, this information that is virtual, it comes into a different shapes and forms, from mass media, your traditional newspapers, your news stations, increasingly your social media platforms, right? So there's an incredible amount of data that is generated already, that is online, and we could look at that describes or in some way references our relationship with wildlife, with different species. Now, this exponential increasing availability of data has occurred in parallel with our increased ability to process data through things like machine learning, right? So if you would be fancy, artificial intelligence, right? So, which means we no longer have to have armies of people processing this by hand. We can develop rules and shortcuts that enable us to treat very, very large amounts of information. And so, for the last 3 years or so, with colleagues on the Edge at the University of Oxford, we've been developing a tool that basically is, in essence, a big web crawler that brings in information about different species. We've focused on mammals, that has a filtering system very similar to your spam filter in your email inbox to weed out the tiger woods and all the other tigers are non-animal related from your data set, and then really, in essence, classifies how much of a conversation there is around this particular species and the type of sentiment, what sort of attitude is described in that content, right? And we've, as I said, developed this for currently pretty much all mammals for the last 3 years. I've given you a couple of examples here. So this one is focused on the pangolin, and I don't choose the pangolin because it's a particularly emblematic species for conflict, but because over the last 3 years there's been quite a bit of a shift in terms of the volume of conversation and the sentiment around pangolins because, of course, of COVID, right, and the origins of COVID and the narrative linking pangolins to its origin. So, as you can see there, around the 2020 or so, of this big bulge in attention, right, on pangolins because of the conversation about the origins of the pandemic. You can see also when it comes to sentiment, right, discussing the sentiment of the conversation around pangolins, that shift where it was a little bit of a dip at the same time as 2020, and then, gladly sort of picking it up back to sort of positive territory. And so I think there's a lot to be said about using these tools that enable us to, just pick up data from, globally, to understand a little bit more how these shifts occur or not, for different entities. Of course, the other nice thing is that we can do this through time, but also spatially, right? So this is, again, still on the pangolin, because there's the 5 minutes I get. No, it doesn't get me a lot more space for more examples. But this is what sort of the sentiment looks like across multiple states. You'll see that some of the interesting results, that some of the range states are not particularly positive, which I think is interesting. a lot of the other non-range states, particularly in Europe, for example, are quite more positive. But again, this is just a primer that I'm happy to talk more about. Thank you very much. I will hand over to Camilla.
So, and I feel very traditional now coming after Diogo, because focusing on policy and policy making, of course, and collaborative governance is something that we've been doing for quite some time. And I'm teaching a course at Umeå University which has the subtitle something like, why does it never turn out as planned? Focusing on policy analysis, and that pretty much captures also the content of policies and the challenge to actually set up policies and with certainty know that we will have an outcome as planned. So there's of course a lot of work that has been done about this, but still there is also a need to focus more on we're constantly learning on how to be better in monitoring policy and policy making and trying to interpret the outcome of this. And some parts of this some of the problems with this is that, of course, the theories that we have doesn't really work out in practice because of the complexity of many of the policies, but also because our theories of change or our theories of moving from A to B may be old or may be building on assumptions that are not related to different parts of the world and so on. But there are, of course, different types of frameworks that we can use, and many of them focus on the input that we put into policy. For example, monitoring efforts like resources that we spend on a policy, which is, of course, very important. But it's not enough to stay there, even though that's a lot of the focus that we, in particular as taxpayers, focus on when we evaluate policies. There's also a lot of effort put on output, which could be, for example, the outcome of or the output of a policy, which is more like the management plans or stuff that immediately focuses on the problem that we're trying to solve. But that's not enough either, because what we need to focus on more specifically and what we often miss is to measure the results achieved by the outputs. And that's where the tricky part comes into the policy analysis. And what the research suggests is that we need to be better at structuring policy objectives so that we actually, for example, work on hierarchies of objectives that we want to achieve, but that we also develop systems of indicators that is related to a more program logic or the program logic models that we can test and then evaluate and assess over time. And these type of policies and these type of methods will also increase the learning, but also the evaluation, the possibilities to evaluate in particular the outcome of policies, which will in turn also increase the capacity for management. So these two things are really interrelated. So how we work with the policy and how we structure the policy objectives and develop the system of indicators based on established program logic models and how that then can increase our capacity. So there is a lot of work and there's a lot of knowledge based on this, but still as I started to say, we don't tend to have that patience to actually follow this through and to really set up these evaluative programs to follow the process. And this is of course also then related to the second part of this indicator, or suggested indicator, and that's the quality of the process of engagement, where there's also a lot of work that has been done and where you can focus on the different part of the process. And often we focus on the process part per se, the middle part here, where we, for example, measure the legitimacy of the process, or the viability of the process, whether we can keep up the process over time, and not only focusing on the specific projects, for example. But what also needs to be done here is to focus on the actors. So what do the actors actually get out of being involved in the process? So, for example, is it better for them to stay in the process? Do they achieve their goals by staying in the process? Or is it better for them to be on the outside, so to say, and giving opinion about the process? But also, and to what extent do that also bring their goals to the table, so to say? But then, of course, also here we need to focus on the outcome, and that's also where the policy then, where this goes together with the policy. And there are, of course, different indicators that can be used here as well, like, for example, focusing on equity. Do all the actors that have been involved, do they actually get heard and also get their proposition through this type of process? And in the end, of course, we need to also focus on the sustainability aspects of these processes. But there's a lot of work that has been done on these, and these are, of course, only two suggestions on how you can structure this and how we can divide these indicators into smaller components and set up programs to follow these through. So, thank you.
Thank you very much to Simon, Camila, and Diogo for presenting this. And I think this was a very well captured how complex this is and how there are ways to do it. It's just how do we scale it up and how do we ensure that these kind of methods are used in countries. And I think with this, I would like to invite our panelists for today. Nolwenn Drouet-Hoguet from France, from the French Biodiversity Agency, to join us on the stage. Richard Fryer from the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism from Namibia. Rogério de Paula from Instituto Chico Mendes of Biodiversity Conservation with Ministry of Environment in Brazil. Dean Smith from Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies from the States. And Ramesh Pandey from Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change in India. So if you join us on the stage, we can start with the panel. So first of all, thank you very much for joining the panel. I think this is a very challenging position that we put you in. But I guess we can start what the two main questions of today are. First one is your country measuring already human-wildlife conflict, and how? And if not, how would you do it? Maybe we can start with Nolwenn.
Yes, is it okay?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Luna, for the introduction. So just to say that I'm really pleased to be here today. So it's a good opportunity it's a good opportunity. No, it's working. Is it working? Yes. So it's a really good opportunity for my country to be here as well. So it's on this really important subject. The French Agency for Biodiversity actually is in charge of wildlife monitoring, and also we are carrying on some applied research to management issue and conservation. So this is really a subject of interest. So we are doing some monitoring in France regarding human and wildlife conflict, not coexistence. So monitoring is in place, and we also have some database, but we focus up to now only on the impact. So if I take the example of wolves, because we don't have, we have also as a species, conflicting species. We've got lynx, we have also bears and jaguars, but we can also have some difficulties with otters and seals. So this is not only about large carnivores, this is much larger than large carnivores. So if I go back to the example of the wolves, we've got a central database, and within within we have some reports on depredation. So we do report depredation from district level, so really local, to region, to national, and we do this for each type of species. So it could be sheep, bovine, equine, and others. So the data is the database is in place for that. One comment about how it is fit. We talk up to now in terms of number, in terms of victims. So to give you an idea, we have about 11,000 victims, mostly sheep in France. But we feel that these figures does not reflect the real situation, because you have no comparison. So in the future, we would like better to think in terms of percentage of farmers which encounter some conflicts, for instance, or to report the number of conflicts to the size of the territory, which will be more understandable for people. So. We also monitor illegal killing. So, yes, so illegal killing is reported into a database. Also, other mortality, which are coming from humans. So I don't know if we need to include them into conflict, if it's not intentional, but we record all the victims from road traffic accident, for instance. So as mortalities, and also we also monitor wolf, and there is also the wolf monitoring, and I think it's important to put into a perspective the damages and also the state of the wolf population. If we think in terms of coexistence, that means that we've got some viable human and livelihood, but also viable population. So we also carry on wolf population monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Richard?
Yes, thanks, Luna. Good afternoon, everybody. Measuring human-wildlife conflict and how in Namibia, I can honestly say yes and no. And I'll explain it now quickly. When it comes to measuring how many incidences and things like that, yes, in communal conservancies, we have got very, very good data. And the reason for that is because we have got as I explained yesterday, the self-reliance scheme, where we pay offset farmers for their losses. Now, in order for them to be paid for their losses, they have to give us the data. So it's very easy to capture or to collect that data, because there's a financial benefit out of that. Our policy says the self-reliance scheme is only applicable to communal farmers, farmers on communal land and resettlement farms, but not commercial farmers. And that's where the problem comes in. We have very, very little data. Well, actually, I can say, little data of conflict that happens on commercial farms, because commercial farms are not being compensated, or their losses are not being offsetted. And there's a reason for that. it's all about sustainability. There's just not enough funds to cover the entire Namibia when it comes to human-wildlife conflict and to pay their losses. Another reason is because commercial farmers have other means of protecting, they've got better ways of protecting their livestock, but they've also got insurance for their livestock. So that's why I say yes, in communal conservancies we've got very good data on how many incidences and so forth, and how do we measure that? But on commercial farms, it's the problem is, and it will still continue to exist because it's not sustainable. We don't have money to pay everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Rogério, the perspective from Brazil.
Hello to all. Thank you for providing this opportunity of sharing this. And I think that I can tell in Brazil it's a little mix of the two examples from France and from Namibia. We started monitoring using a better framework recently. I think because we never knew pretty much if what we're doing was right or wrong. So it's like a way to measure the success of our activities is very important. Brazil leads with lots of conflicts with primates, with sharks, with crocs, and I work for the agency in a research center dealing specifically with carnivores. Most of the problems relies on large cats, but what we're doing right now is we've been monitoring our activities in two levels. In a local level through projects and programs, and this the last 5 years we started working with theory of change models and planning, and from there we start collecting like pretty much the way that was presented, evaluating the outputs, evaluating the impact of our actions in a regional level, assessing a network for state agencies or even other agencies in the federal government, and through national action plans. So in our action plans we have a different way of measuring the impact of the actions and the goals, and from there we put all together and try to make like a bigger model to evaluate it's right and what is wrong, what is going in a proper direction, what's coming out of our control. Putting all this together is a very big challenge, and this is what we're trying to work right now to take to like a broader level and a higher level, like in the environmental ministry, so we can have standardized ways to monitor all this in a better way and get more information out of this. But this is like less than 10 years we've been doing this, and mostly effective in 5 years or so.
Thank you very much. And how do you do it in India, Ramesh?
Since we are talking about wildlife conflict and keeping the global biodiversity framework in the mind, so I would like to say that we have two-pronged strategy so far as the species has to be looked into, because wildlife, the biodiversity is such a big word that we are not sure that which species we are looking for and which species we want to leave. So what we have in our approach is that focusing on the flagship species or umbrella species like tigers, elephants, rhinos, and the second approach is to look into the conflict species like monkey, or in any specific area there is a species which is causing human-wildlife conflict situation. Then we have the national level policy in place. Then at the third level, we have species level guidelines, how to manage them. Then at fourth level, we have the field manuals, that how the field formations will tackle the situation when the wildlife conflict situation arises. Now, the fifth level, I would say, which is a bit, I would say, new and a step going ahead in this area, that we have a application-based system which is called M-Stripe, monitoring of tigers, especially their presence while the staff is patrolling, and also having the assessment of various parameters, including the impact of social interaction. So we are using that data for assessing the presence of the animal, as well as having the kind of pressure which we are having in the tiger reserve. And that data is giving a very good insight to understand the entire dynamics, both of the presence of the animal as well as the kind of pressures we are having in the field. Apart from that, we are also working on the wildlife conflict portal, so that the real-time data can be fed by the field formation, and we can have a robust data system in place, kind of administrative data which can be used for future analysis. So far as the indicators right now which we are using for understanding the situation is basically the direct measurable methods, which may be the loss of the human life, or injuries, or deaths of the animals, or maybe the area under crop depredation, etc. So far as the indirect or intangible reasons are concerned, we are just able to look into the land use, land classification change in a period of time, or the kind of linear infrastructure has come up in a couple of years, or maybe the hot spots because of incidents. So we have this kind of indirect indicators which give us insight. Apart from that, since Camilla was talking about the input, output, and outcome, we have this management effectiveness evaluation system in place to assessing the reserves. But it would be good time that we can think of for when we are thinking of the parameters or the indicators for the human-wildlife conflict. Probably we have to look into the direct and indirect impact measures, both qualitative and quantitative. And thirdly, having the parameters which are directly impacting the lives, as well as socio-economic and cost opportunity related issues. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dean, from the North American perspective?
Thank you. Good afternoon. The Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is the voice of state fish and wildlife agencies in the United States and the provinces and territories in Canada. And so I'm going to break down my comments a little bit more, so just U.S. nationally, and then what the states and provinces do currently. So in the United States, at the federal level, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, or what's referred to as APHIS, addresses approximately 80% of the human-wildlife conflict reports, especially wildlife damage reports. The state fish and wildlife agencies address about the remaining 20%. So APHIS collects this information and houses it in a database, and they have been maintaining a consistent data set for 27 years. And the majority of that data is available online. It's broken down by species and so on. So that data is readily available. And just to give you a few examples, in 2022, APHIS encountered 21.5 million animals causing damage or threatening to cause damage. 91.4% of those animals were dispersed unharmed. while 8.6% were lethally removed. But 79% of those lethally removed were invasive species. So you can see the level of detail that's available in that data. And just to give you kind of a scale of how much effort the US government puts into it, in 2022, APHIS spent $220 million managing wildlife conflict programs. Now, if we step down to what about the other 20% of conflicts that occur in the United States, and very similar issues are encountered in Canadian provinces. So there is no consistent approach to collecting human-wildlife conflict data, and the level of detail of data that is collected is highly variable among the states and provinces in Canada. Some state agencies do track the or the wildlife-human conflict, while some do not track it at all, while the others have like live on-time reporting systems where they're capturing the data directly from the individuals that are involved in the wildlife conflict encounters. The one thing is a very positive step that's being taken now is our association through what we call multi-state grant funding is planning a project by state fish and wildlife agencies to undertake a comprehensive survey of the agency's efforts to monitor human-wildlife conflict. And the desire of this project that will be implemented in the next year or two is to better understand exactly what the states are currently doing for monitoring and managing human-wildlife conflict.
Thank you, everyone. I think you touched on so many complexities of this, whether it's, there's obviously a strong bias towards measuring impact in every country, but also the differences on federal level, on state level. How do we do this? Do we do it on all lands? I think it's very, very complicated. And I think you showed that very well. And I can imagine that with other governments in the room, it would add even more complexity. But let's go to the second question, which is, what are some opportunities you see in the way we propose to measure human-wildlife conflict? So beyond impact, do you see this as something feasible in your country? Do you see it as something that allows for more representative measuring of human-wildlife conflict? And what in general are your thoughts on this? Nolwenn, maybe we can start again with you.
Yes, I can start, and maybe if it's feasible today, tomorrow, I would say no, not tomorrow, we are not ready. But if we think that if we are preparing and said, okay, let's say in 5 years we need to monitor this and this, we can maybe put things behind to go to this objective. So I think it will be really interesting to add a social component to these indicators. If I go back to the number 2, the willingness to coexist with wildlife, to tolerance, social, cultural, political, we can imagine implement some survey, but once we all know that quantitative survey, they don't capture everything because you don't have all the details and you don't have the shade at local level, but it could be one step, but I say it won't be enough. So if we go to quantitative survey, we might also we would like also to add some qualitative survey to have a better understanding of the roots, and and the different shade. So then, in terms of practice, how do you implement this in practice? So do we go, do you do the survey every year, every 5 years, which is different? Maybe you can do something which is easy with a survey, you can do it every year or every 2 years. And the things that are more difficult, that you need to employ more people and it takes more time to analyze. If I go to the qualitative studies, maybe you can go to this indicator every 5 years. So it's something that we need to think. So there is the timing. The timing of the indicator is something to take account. Yes, the timing, the scaling, it will be also, always difficult from local to global, because now we are carrying on some social survey, and we can really see that from one place to another, it's different. The pictures is different. So how do you put this information at a global level? It's tricky. It's really tricky. So we need to keep this in mind. Of course, how do one issue also will be the long term and the feasibility in terms of money, and who is going to do that? Who will be in charge of doing this survey? So this one, we need to think about this issue. Yes, and there will be also a question of the calibration of the methods between all the countries, but maybe there are some. The work can be done on this. And one question was also, do we go for one indicator for each species or for a bunch of problematic wildlife species, which must be different because they are different as well, and there are some different type of monitoring in the country as well. So. Yes, it what was coming into my mind. Just one example which come into my mind as well. So recently talking with some breeders, they said, okay, there are lots of effort are devoted to evaluate the health of the wildlife, but nothing is devoted to my health, you know. So the health of people is something really to take into account, and maybe to put into the indicators. Yes, the last survey, social survey that we did also in France, it brings this health on the table, and they want to have like a walk disease, which is called the wolf disease. So to take into account that they are really stressed and they are overworked. So it might be one idea, but I don't know how to monitor that. But
no, thank
you have some experience for that.
No, thank you for those comments. I think we will figure it out eventually. And Richard, your perspective?
Okay, I'm going to keep this very short and sweet now. So I think research and monitoring is something that's very underestimated, and I think that is something that's a tool that can greatly help with HWC. I also feel that public engagement is also underestimated. We need to engage more with the communities, people on commercial farms and so forth. Together with public engagement, also raise public awareness for human-wildlife conflict. And lastly, I would say the application of revenues, especially when it comes to problem-causing animals. I think with you know, if you channel the money correctly with problem-causing animals, especially on commercial farms, you will find people changing their minds, and you will get data from them, and so forth. Just these retaliation killings on commercial farms, people just don't report on it because they're scared they're going to get into trouble. So they absolutely don't report on it, and they keep it quiet. They do it in the darkness of night and so forth. So yeah, I think those 4 things, if we can look at those, I think we'll gain momentum there. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, makes sense. Rogério?
And I agree too, with what Richard said, and I think that We have been working in these two levels, and the two levels, I think it all, like Camila presented, in terms of complexity, and in a smaller scale, we look at the efficiency, and in a broader scale, the effectiveness. It's what we're trying to do, looking at specific theory of change models for smaller actions, and when we're looking at the changes in the attitudes in a broader scale, it's looking more towards bigger strategies and regional strategies, national strategies. And for me, it's totally, it makes a good sense of interacting all this, and we need to compare the data among countries. Tomorrow we have the Latin American session, and we bring in some of the information from other countries from Latin America and how we can integrate this, and I think this is very important to integrate the base, to integrate the information that is being generated, integrating the methods to evaluate, but I still curious to see how we apply everything that is being conducted, everything that's being generated into this global framework. How we can adjust to use everything that's being done in the countries to put together, and we can measure this in a proper way in order to not lose everything that's made so far. So, but in general, I think this is, I feel happy to see what's happening, because I feel that we're moving to the same direction in Brazil.
Thank you. Ramesh?
Since we are discussing the three proposed components on its national context, I would go through all three components one by one. The first component which has been proposed is the incidences of the negative impacts or encounters on the people and wildlife. This is measurable and is being adopted. I mean, it is in use in our country. Here, what I would like to say is that right now we are only looking into the tangible impacts. Still, we don't have the data of intangible impacts. So if we are deliberating this as one of the components, we should look both the tangible and intangible impacts, and we require to further granularize it, that what should be the intangible impacts. Then if we see the willingness to coexist with the wildlife, it's very good to see that such issues have started coming in deliberation. The tolerance, social and cultural and political aspects have been mentioned, that probably, but I think that we should also focus on the economic aspect, which is being told by one of the speakers as opportunity cost loss aspect. So probably we have to go into this aspect also and try to factor in best possible way. It's not easy to factor in, but this is one area which can be included. And here, as I said, the tangible and intangible, in the first one here, we should have the both qualitative and quantitative aspects of this parameter. Then if we see the quality of the processes of engagement, policy and capacity for the efficient management, it's very well taken. We are not monitoring it, but we are monitoring in some other forms, in some other assessment processes, not specifically to the wildlife conflict issue. And here also, when we are deliberating to include it as one of the components, then we have to look into the quality and quantity aspect both. So if I have to summarize that whether these three components are important and should be taken as monitoring indicators, I would say yes, they are very well thought of, but we should categorize them into the tangible and intangible, and in qualitative and quantitative parameters. So probably we have to have a matrix of qualitative parameters and quantitative parameters, and then if we are putting them into the columns, then in rows we have to have the tangible measures are the impacts and intangible measures are impact. And likewise, as we have seen in other type of evaluation processes, we probably have to have more finely defined matrix on these lines, which should be measurable, and we should capture both the qualitative and quantitative aspect. Even, for example, if I say that, suppose I am taking the example of the third parameters, which is the quality of processes of engagement, policy and capacity for the efficient management. A country may have a policy, may have a guideline, but whether this guideline is reaching to the bottom of the pyramid, whether the people are happy with it or not, whether they are rolling it out or not, these are the qualitative aspect of the parameters. So probably we using these three very important components and putting them into the tangible and intangible parameters, and then their qualitative and quantitative aspects, we may have a matrix kind of thing, which from India's perspective, I can say that we have seen it in the MEE processes, which is a very exhaustive evaluation. It's quite possible that we can come up with a good system which can be replicated across the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, please.
Thank you. So I would agree that the three components that have been identified for the human-wildlife conflict component of Target 4 are well thought out. They're on target, for poor pun. But we need to think about how we can actually do or accomplish the measurements on each one of them. And I agree on we need qualitative and quantitative. They're both informative to knowing whether you've had any positive effects or not. The first component, the indices of negative impacts, I think is already being monitored to some extent by many parties in North America, as I noted in the examples that I provided in my earlier comments. I think the real challenge when you take that to the global level is, can you identify the critical few measurements that help you determine what the real impacts are from human-wildlife conflict? Do we just count the number of incidences of contact with wildlife? Do we have to figure out the economics, the opportunity costs, and so on, as Simon talked about? The second and third components could be addressed using social science information that to date really has been underutilized by the parties, partially because of limited knowledge and capacity to implement the necessary methods of data collection. It's much easier to just count incidences and measure the first part, but when you try to get into understanding things like Simon mentioned, the tolerance, well, the social sciences can help you undertake systems to be able to accurately measure that across countries and determine that. And one of the ways that that's already being done to some extent is through our Global Wildlife Value Survey that's being led by Drs. Manfredo and Drs. Teal at Colorado State University, but there's a global team of approximately 40 social scientists around the world that are working on this project. And having robust social science methods that can be adopted can help to monitor the trends in terms of people's willingness to coexist with wildlife. And so this will give you a bit of a quantitative, but it also, I think, is a tool that can help inform some of the qualitative measurements. And for example, the Global Wildlife Value Survey today has over 20,000 residents, or measurements from 20,000 residents in 31 countries across Europe, the Americas, Australia, China, and South Africa. Certainly, I think there needs to be some effort put into working out how to measure values among indigenous communities in all the different continents. But certainly the survey does provide two primary value dimensions: mutualism, which is seeing wildlife as part of one's community, and domination, which is viewing wildlife as a resource for human use. The Global Wildlife Values Survey offers an existing and refined and peer-reviewed monitoring framework that has cross-cultural validity and provides a cost-efficient sampling strategy. Adopting a framework such as the Global Wildlife Values Survey could create globally comparable data over time to monitor trends of willingness to coexist with wildlife and the quality of processes of engagement or acceptance of specific human-wildlife conflict management actions.
Thank you, everyone. Really, a lot of new questions that came out of the discussion, but also some ideas and examples of how it's done already. So I think now it's just a discussion of how we scale it up. I will turn to the audience now for comments, questions, ideas. So I see a microphone, an arm there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Jorgensen, and I work both in film and as a social scientist, and have covered many, many conferences for the UN in Geneva on biotrade and bioagriculture and other issues. And but my first love is on human wildlife protection and learning to survive together. The big question that I had for you is that what I see here in a lot of these preliminary things and a lot of the research coming out is very similar to research that I saw being presented at Biotrade and at these conferences where the administrative requests for data from the local people was so invasive and so hard to produce that either there were huge gaps in it, which made it less than effective, or they spent so much time doing it like we do in grant writing that you didn't have time to actually do the work, and so it was counterproductive. And so that's the first thing I would say is that we say in my industry, keep it simple, stupid. The more we can keep it simple and direct and get to the source. And one of the things I love that you mentioned, I've seen so many people try to deal with this idea of being able to stuff this into an international formula that works for everybody. And I think that's the first serious mistake that is made, that we need to understand the issue of process, that this is an ongoing process, and the more we try to define it, the more the horse is out of the barn and we lose it. So in a lot of my work, I've worked with perceptual indices that have both a quantitative element that can be defined and assessed, but also allows for the community to put in their own perceptual component of what's working or not. And I have found that it is through those that we find out what the community believes. So you have some writing variables that are generic and over the top, but you allow the community to give you their own sense of what is important, what's working or not, and you keep that open-ended, because the more we social scientists try to define things or conservation, the more we lose the public, and it's like chemically describing an apple. Do you really get the taste of it? So I urge you to really keep that qualitative, quantitative balance, and to keep it simple, because my experience is people will just say, go away.
Thank you very much for that comment. I mean, the specialist group sees this as a process, definitely, and we were thinking also in terms of making an indicator more of a framework that can be applied differently in different countries. We don't want to insist on one thing that we will force countries to, or, well, we cannot enforce anything, but that we would try to force anywhere else where countries are not willing to do. And one way that we want to avoid this is by involving parties from the very beginning, and I think this session serves that purpose, among other things. And just before we go to the next question, this is the link where you can also submit your ideas, and if you know any specific examples of how to measure something, you can go there, but I didn't mention it before, so. Paula?
I don't know. Open? So I don't know if it's a question. I am from the Israeli Nature and Park Authority, so we have the mandate to deal with human life conflicts, and we have been, so data is not our problem. We have been gathering data. We have an app where our rangers can add what are the actions that have been done, what was the damage, and now that app is open to the public, so the public themselves are complaining, and what Israelis love is to complain. So we have lots of those. Our problem is to actually take that data and basically create those tools that will see if what they are doing is effective. So because the data is very messy. So I guess our goal is to see how we can take messy and dirty data and create an indicator that the rangers that actually doing the work, doing the process will understand if what they have been doing is effective enough. Is it time to stop? For example, in some of our calling programs, should we stop calling at this point, or should we continue? And this is what we are trying to move towards now. And about the social aspect, we found that, although we are a very small country, so it's easy, but we found that public engagement, allowing them to have this talk with government officials and kind of reduce their fear, reduce and a lot of publications about the animals, about their behavior and why are they acting the way they're acting, kind of helps to reduce that negative attitudes towards wildlife. So I don't know how to measure that yet, but I do know that from several public engagements that we've done repeatedly, you can see the attitude change.
Yeah, and I think the public engagement across the board has been identified as a really positive thing. Yeah, I see another question there, or comment.
So thank you for introducing these different concepts. I'm Maria Johansson, environmental psychology at Lund University. And I'm sort of thinking if there has been any considerations of including any of the existing mental well-being indexes or instruments that's used worldwide, and if it would be possible to connect that to data on wildlife and other aspects relevant here.
So what we are going to do, and Alex is going to announce it at the end, is we want to start this process where we put exactly that, people who work on social sciences, people who work on mental health-being, so everyone in the same room to share these kind of knowledge and experiences and indices, because we might not know of them. So definitely there will be an effort on that. It hasn't been done so far as I know, but we will work on that. Any other comments?
Yeah, Jim Gaza from Belgium. I had a question. In the CBD, one of the other targets or topics is the sustainable use of wildlife. First of all, is there an indicator already? I don't think so. And secondly, should it not be a joint moment or idea now, if you're going to measure human-wildlife conflicts, to also have indicators for measuring use of wildlife, let alone if it's sustainable or not, but at least measuring it or gathering indicators?
I think the best person to answer that question is Cristina Rodina from FAO, because she's been involved also in the development of the indicator on sustainable use.
Yeah, indeed, thank you for this question. So basically, for target 5, there is no indicator exist at the moment. But they're good news. So there are a number of organizations which are part of the Collaborative Partnership on Sustainable Wildlife Management, or the CPW in short, and also led by Traffic. They put together a proposal how this indicator can look like. So at the moment, the indicator broadly called sustainable use of wild species, but this indicator, I think, is going through the similar process as the human-wildlife conflict ones, and in my personal humble opinion, that indicator is even much more complicated because you have sustainable use of very different species in terms of taxa and type of uses, consumptive, non-consumptive, and it might be also good to, but this is something that we will need to discuss, maybe even to start looking at this, both indicators in terms of the rollout, development process, and in the end of the day, piloting it with countries, and also the most important is the fundraising and the resources, maybe together. But this is something that also, it's available online. If you go to the, I can't remember the website, but it's a metadata which is submitted to the CBD, and you can look at it. And I think the best person to answer that question would be my colleague from UNEP-WCMC.
Hi, all. Yeah, so what Christina was saying, UNEP-WCC is hosting a website called Post-2020 Indicators, where you can find metadata on all the adopted headline indicators. So our plan is to update the metadata before ARCTEC, so the Ad Hoc Technical Expert Group, which will convene in April and then again in September. So we want to make this information accessible and easy for everyone. So the website is post2020indicators.org. We are also planning potentially to collect metadata for component indicators as well, such as the human-wildlife conflict one, but there's more than 50, so it's a process to reach out to all the data providers, but we are working on that, and if you want, I can later on write the website somewhere where it's post2020indicators.org for all the metadata, which will be updated again this year.
Thank you, Christina and Matteo. And I see another question from Steve.
Yeah, Steve Michel with Parks Canada. I just want to follow up on something that Dean mentioned there that I think is an important point, and I know it's something that we've struggled with in our national parks when we look at our data. We know that we've got a really strong correlation between overall incident numbers and our visitation to national parks. We know that our visitation is continuing to go up. And we know that over time our incident data is going to continue to go up, but the vast majority of those incidents are fairly minor. And so Dean mentioned, what do we look at? Is it an actual contact from an animal? And that's what we've been struggling with a little bit to determine what that very tiny subset of incidents needs to be that we should actually be tracking. And I guess the other part of it for me is looking at it from a relative, like a proportional perspective in terms of the visitation we have. And I think you could have all sorts of other similar examples with agriculture and things like that. But if we say look at like bear attacks or something like that, right now we have one bear attack on a visitor for about every 13 million visitors that come to our national parks. And if 10 years from now we have twice as many bear attacks on the surface, that's going to look like a failure. But if we've gone to, 1 in 20 million visitors, to me that's a win. So I don't know if it's a question really or just a thought to throw out there, but I think it's not just looking at incidences, but also to some sort of relative proportional metric as well, whatever that human use metric might be, visitation, agriculture, whatever it is.
So I'll just respond on that a little bit. I think you're getting at an important point, and I think Simon was going there a little bit too, in that you've got the incidence numbers, but how can you use those incidence numbers to actually model what the full impact is? Because it's kind of like if you're doing performance reporting, are you measuring outputs or outcomes? And the incidents in it are really just the data, and when you want to be able to translate that by modeling or whatever to get to the longer term impact, I think that's going to be probably the harder part of this. It'll be easy to collect the data, but what's the model to tell you what the impact is, and how are those impacts different in different regions of the country or the continents?
Yeah, it's interesting, the discussion, because we had like 20 years of data of incidents from all over Brazil and all over the sources of incidents. And we're not using this data when you're comparing to data that we're being proactively collecting through like direct projects, direct actions that is already answering questions that this data will feed into a model. So it's like two different treatments. And I think this is a way that we should have, like I said, integrating the information that we had to what we're answering right now, putting this into a model. I think this is important that this came out, because I think we have enormous database in several countries, and we can lose all this because we have like in our time frame, things that are happening like in the last 20 years or like 30, 40, 50 years, things that we start measuring from now on. So how we can integrate this in a way of not losing all this database that we have from the past.
Thank you. Should we take one last question, and then we slowly need to close the session?
Question for the panelists. You all mentioned subsidies or compensation for human-wildlife conflicts. Is there monitoring happening already, and shouldn't there be some on effectivity of those subsidies or compensation schemes? And who should pay this monitoring? Environmental governments, farming governments, does it matter?
Does anyone want to take the question?
I can't answer that comprehensively, but there are certainly compensation programs for wildlife damage, both in the United States and Canada. In Canada, the majority of that comes out of agriculture crop insurance programs. In the United States, those are mainly coming again out of the United States Department of Agriculture programs and so on. I'm not aware of some of the state programs that may exist, but they may be out there. So it does occur. Is the data being, certainly they know how much money is being spent. Do they know whether that's having an impact on changing behaviors or creating programs that reduce the amount of conflict so that there's fewer dollars paid out in compensation? I don't think that side of the analysis is well known.
Just to add on, in Namibia we do pay for losses we try not to refer to it as a compensation scheme, but rather an offset system. The compensation schemes have proven to be problematic and open for abuse. And the money basically comes through it's money generated through trophy hunting, park entry fees, tourism concessions, and so forth. So that's where the money is generated, and it goes into what we call the Game Products Trust Fund, and then people are paid out of that.
Thank you. And Ramesh, just very briefly.
In India, every such incident is compensated financially, and both the federal union government through its schemes, which are specific species schemes, and also schemes for the landscapes, the either loss for the human life or loss for the cattle or for the crop depredation, compensations are given. State governments have their own schemes and programs through which the compensations are given. There are quite robust system of monitoring the compensation in many of these states, and they have their online system, apps developed for it. People can apply and can get. So there are backlogs. Sometimes it takes time, and we also do not know that how much impact on the society it is making. And but yes, there is a very good system of compensating losses being caused in human-wildlife conflict situations. And there are insurance schemes also of the government of India, which gives money in case of the crop damage. So it is, I would say, it is the intrinsic part of the human-wildlife management system in the country.
Thank you. And before I give the word to Mariano Castro Jimenez from the CBD Secretariat for his very short reflections, and then Alex to close the session, I just want to point out that I put out, this is the website that Matea mentioned about the indicators that is developed and managed by the UNEP-WCMC, so you can see it here. And Mariano?
So thank you very much. I feel that, just as I mentioned earlier, this is precisely a very valuable exercise. It comes in a moment in which we have a lot of questions, and I think that we're living probably with even more questions. But it's very valid because we're deciding on how to move forward. Alexandra mentioned earlier about the negotiations and how things shifted, and I feel that this is a point that I really want to remark here. Can you imagine having 196 parties coming together in a long process and agreeing on such an ambitious framework? I guess that this shows that we can do things together, and I hope that this gives us some optimism for the road ahead, which I acknowledge that it's going to be and require a lot of work. I also would like to highlight some of the really interesting things that were mentioned today, the use of technology, how to better engage in processes, how to better use data, for example, analyzing and understanding costs, building on successful practices and successful policies. And something that I think the Brazilian colleague mentioned, and I feel that it's very valuable as well, is exchanging with different parties, different countries, learning from each other what works, what doesn't work, what can we do together to make this even work better. There's several reflections today that I wrote down, and I feel that are going to be very valuable, and I'm very optimistic again about how things will move forward. And I thank you again for this space.
Great. Well, we are already out of time, so I'm going to wrap this up pretty quickly. But thanks. I think this has been an interesting and useful session to start thinking about these things, and I thank the panelists for their insights from their countries, because this is really putting this, the challenge here is very much about figuring out what to measure, measuring what matters, And also then, I would say, using that as an opportunity, because if you measure the right thing, then you're also driving the actual challenge forward into the right direction. Otherwise, you might distract, where the funding goes into things that actually are not creating the change. And this is why those underlying measures of process and of social capacity are so important, rather than the over-focus on the disputes, like we heard in the keynote earlier. But can we bring in some of those lower layers of societal drivers into the actual measurement, and that in turn could catalyze change. So, but, that's all very grand. As many people said, we got to keep it simple. 196 countries have to sort of adopt this and be okay with it. And so this is a trade-off of coming up with something that is beautifully simple and adaptable within, and several people mentioned the concept should be a framework within which every case, every country can then tweak it. So we're suggesting that maybe the broad outline of it is comparable across the world, but within it, it's adaptable. So the next steps in this then tangibly are, we've thought about this quite a lot, and it seems to need a balance of technical experts, people who have done similar things in other sectors, like we heard examples from psychology, and we know that there's examples in the development sector and so on, and people who have really thought about the detail. Let's call that the technical stream. And then we need the governments who actually need to do this and get the reality check of, is it actually feasible? And is it feasible in the landscape of all the millions of things that you need to do and measure? Because this is one target, and there's a whole lot more, right? And so what we're proposing is a kind of ad hoc working group over the next 18 months that anyone could join, but we'll make sure that there's a nice balance and a lot of parties involved in that to keep cross-checking the feasibility against the technical ideal. Since we're now in the world of Zoom calls, that's probably doable with not too much resource need. So we're happy to go ahead and try and facilitate a few initial meetings like that. Anyone is welcome to join in on that if they have time to give to this. And so here you can add some thoughts, but also you can put your email address, because then we can reach out to you and maybe alert you to like a follow-up call or something like that, if you want. Or pass it on to colleagues who you think might be interested. Okay? Great, well, thanks for coming, and it's coffee break again.